Hello everybody, it's Mr. Second Amendment, and today we are doing a video on how to clean an AR-15. Now I do have a video on this I did, it's about 10 years old. That video is still not going to steer you wrong. If you want to reference that, that one's going to be a very detailed cleaning. I felt like an update was in order because we've had a lot of new gun buyers in the past 2.5 years, a lot of which have bought AR-15s. Also, since I did that video, there's been a lot more experience, a lot more exposure to the AR-15, seeing a lot of high mileage stuff. And basically, I feel better equipped to give you a better video that's going to help you out a lot more than that one did from a decade ago. So what we're going to be doing is cleaning the excessive carbon, getting rid of, excessive fouling, lead, copper, especially carbon, just to get it out of there after a good range session. This AR that I'm going to be cleaning, my AR pistol here, just using a carbine course, it has about 450 rounds on it since its last cleaning. So it'd be a good opportunity to show you what it looks like when it's pretty dirty or it's getting there. So we're going to clean it up. Next thing I'm going to show you as we're doing this throughout the different parts and the different stages of this, I'm going to be showing you things to be on the look for, because we're not just cleaning the gun, but we're also going to be checking certain areas or critical things on the gun just to make sure everything is still in good working order. That includes inspecting for weird or unusual wear patterns or parts that might be on the verge of needing replacement. And then the last thing is I'll show the key lubrication areas, how we're going to lubricate it just to get it ready for its next use. Couple kind of rules of the road on this video. This video is going to be geared towards your standard DI or direct impingement AR-15. Being a gunsmith these days in civilian life, I guess not to nerd out too much, but your standard AR-15 is not a true direct impingement system. It's actually an internal piston system. The bolt itself is the piston, and the carrier is almost like the engine block. But just with slang and everything, we call it a DI or a direct impingement AR-15. It's standard design. So we're not going to cover any piston guns or external piston AR-15s. Every company kind of has their own way of doing that. This is just going to handle or cover the standard AR-15, which I think most people have for sure. And if you bought an AR-15 the last year or two, it probably is a direct impingement, a DI design. So that's what we're going to cover in this video. The next thing is, especially you former grunts or 11 Bravos or 03 series in the Marines, any of you former infantrymen, you also know that trying to turn your weapon in to the arms room or the armory, usually they need that white glove standard, as in if I put a white glove on and just ran my fingers through the upper and all the parts, that nothing's going to come off on the glove. This weapon system does not need to be at that white glove standard to run and be very successful and reliable. So we're going to clean just what we need to. There is still going to be some carbon, and that's going to be okay. There are critical areas that we want to make sure we get all the carbon out of, and I'll show you those places as we go. But just understand, if you're expecting a very detailed, just extreme fine-tooth comb cleaning of every speck of carbon, that's not going to happen in this video, and frankly the gun doesn't need it. And lastly, bringing on new experience, new things I've learned from active duty, deployments, armor school, gunsmithing. We do have full autos and a bunch of rental ARs at work. So watching high mileage of what happens over time and how it stacks up and different things to be looking for. Again, that's part of the reason I'm doing this video, this updated version, because there's a lot more that I can share with you now from a lot more experience. So with that said, let's get started. So first thing we're going to do is keep it pointed in a safe direction. We are going to clear it and make sure that it's totally empty. First step we'll do, besides keeping it in a safe direction, is we're going to place it on safe or attempt to place it on safe. Now, in your standard AR-15 design, you're able to place it on safe if the hammer is cocked. And some guys like to store their ARs with the hammer depressed. But when that happens and the hammer is in the forward position, you're not able to put it on safe. So that first step is, if it's not already on safe, place it on safe, or at least attempt to do so. And again, everything is pointed in a safe direction at all times, but now that we've placed it on safe or attempted to, we're going to go ahead and remove the magazine by pushing our magazine release button and removing the magazine. Next, again, pointing in a safe direction at all times, we're going to lock the bolt to the rear, and we're going to do that by holding down on the bottom portion of our bolt release, a bolt catch. While I'm maintaining pressure on the bottom portion of the bolt catch, I'm going to go ahead and pull the charging handle all the way. I can then let go of the charging handle and then let go of my bolt release. Last thing we're going to do is manually push the charging handle forward into its forward position. Now that we got the bolt locked to the rear, if we were not able to put it on safe before, let's go ahead and do that now. Next, we will inspect the chamber, and it's kind of hard to get the lighting, but you can see that we do not have a round in the chamber itself. And we're also going to look inside the upper receiver, make sure that we don't have any rounds hanging out inside. And now at this point, we know that it is totally clear. Now that we have verified that the gun is unloaded, we're going to go ahead and drop the bolt or advance the bolt in its most forward position. And we're going to do that by pushing our bolt release down and in, and that releases the bolt. And shown from the other side, this is what's happening. The bolt just released, and now it's in its full forward position. Now this next step is not 100% necessary, but we are going to remove the sling, or you may choose to remove the sling. In this case, especially if you have a sling that is a quick detach style, we're just going to get the sling out of the way. Next thing we're going to do is separate the upper receiver group from the lower receiver group, and that's done with these two pins right here. Now these are captive pins. This is our rear takedown pin, and you can see that's as far as it's supposed to go, and this is our front pivot pin, and that's as far as that's supposed to go. So by pushing these out, we can now unlock the upper receiver from the lower receiver. So we could push it from the left side and pull it out from the right side. Now you'll notice I've got this hinging action. Getting the front pivot pin out, a bit of advice is to kind of squeeze the upper and lower together as if it was together, and that'll give you an easier shot at pushing out that front pivot pin. And now we've separated our upper receiver group from our lower receiver group. Now on some builds, the upper and lower fit is very tight, especially if they're Cerakote or something like that. So you may not be able to just push it out with your fingers and pull it from left to right on the other side. You may have to use a punch with just a little gentle tapping, and you should be able to free it that way. These pins are not supposed to come out. Once we've separated the upper from the lower, I like to go ahead and put these pins back in place. That's going to prevent the possibility of damage. If these pins are out and I were to drop it, this could bend this pin. This could, even worse, open up or wallow out the hole that the pin is in the lower receiver itself. So as soon as I got the upper separated from the lower, I like to go ahead and put those pins back in place just to prevent from any damage. So we can go ahead and set our upper receiver group to the side, and we'll just be dealing with the lower receiver group first. First thing that I like to do is check to make sure my pistol grip is not loose, and that's just providing a little tension, trying to see if this pistol grip is loose at all. There is a screw in there. Don't know if you can kind of see it there. That's 35 inch-pounds is what that screw should be set to, and we just want to make sure that our pistol grip has not come loose and that it is fully tight. Next thing I want to check for is making sure that my buffer tube itself is not loose, this castle nut is not loose, and I like to grab the brace or stock and just try to twist it and see if there's any rotational play. We just want to make sure that that is still secured. If you do have staking on your castle nut, like I do here, you can see some material is, if I can get in focus, pushed at two locations into that side of the castle nut. We just want to make sure that the staking is still indexed the way it should be and that nothing is loose or moving around. Now this next step is not totally necessary, but first I just make sure the stock or brace is moving and snapping in place, does not want to come off. But the next step that's not totally necessary is you could remove your stock or brace, and we're going to do that. Whatever the design of stock or brace, your adjustment latch here, if you pull it all the way down, then it'll get you off the buffer tube and you can remove it and reinstall it that way. Honestly, no real reason to take off your stock or brace. You could do it just to inspect, make sure everything's looking good here. The only reason you would really need to do this is if you did a carbine course, things got sandy or muddy, you've got sand scraping in here, you've got mud or something packed into your brace or stock. But otherwise, under normal conditions, you don't really need to take your brace or stock off. But it may be necessary depending on how dirty it is. Next, we're going to remove our buffer and action spring. That's being held in place by this buffer retainer plunger. I like to just take a cleaning brush, and it helps that the hammer is cocked. Just push that down, and it'll get kind of stuck up like that, and just kind of wiggle it out so we can inspect our buffer and action spring. Next, we're going to check to make sure this buffer retainer plunger is still captured by the buffer tube, and just kind of push up and down on it just to make sure that that stud or that peg is still there. You would have known it by taking it apart. The buffer and action spring would have gone flying. But as long as the peg is there, it's still actuating, and it's got plenty of coverage under the buffer tube, that the buffer tube is successfully holding it in place. It will be good to go. Now, one thing you may choose to do, and most of the time not totally necessary, at least every time, I got a little bit of oil on this brush, and just a little bit, just kind of working it in to the buffer retainer plunger and just making sure that's lubricated and good to go. Next, we're going to inspect the buffer itself, and we're going to remove it from the spring and just check it out. We're going to look at the face of it, just kind of wipe that down, and you can kind of see on the perimeter of this, it's a little worn away. This will be about natural, nothing to be too concerned about, and that'll happen from just the back of your bolt carrier through lots of repetitions, lots of cycling, especially if there's any burrs or anything on the back of your carrier. It's going to be a pretty normal wear pattern to see that, and that's totally fine. What we don't want to see is huge gouges or impacts along the rim of the face of our buffer. That would let us know that our buffer retainer plunger is the one that's actually taking the beating. Now, with the in-spec AR, or things are working correctly, the buffer retainer plunger is just holding the buffer and action spring back, just for maintenance, easy disassembly. But when I'm snapping the gun together, the back of the carrier should push the buffer slightly back. You can kind of see that camming action where the back of the carrier is now taking up the tension, and that buffer retainer plunger is no longer contacting the face of the buffer. That's how things should be, but if you have a carrier that's too short or something is out of spec, even by closing this down, the buffer is still being captured by the retainer plunger, which is what we don't want to see. And we're going to know it's a problem by looking at our buffer face itself, seeing huge gouges and impacts. So we'll just inspect these parts with an action spring. There's not too much to worry about here. You will have a little bit of either surface carbon or the inside lining of the buffer tube over time will wear off. This is going to be normal. For our buffer, we do want to check that this roll pin is still there. Some quality control issues, they might forget to install this roll pin at the factory, and that is containing this rubber end piece. We also want to make sure that this roll pin is not too proud, where it's sticking out on either end too much and binding up with our spring. Next thing we can do is clean out the inside of the buffer tube itself. This may not be necessary all the time, only when it's really dirty or every so often, especially guys that are running suppressed. You're going to have carbon all up in your lower. Just taking a 20 gauge brush with an oily rag and just kind of cleaning out the inside. Doesn't take much, and honestly, this is not something you would need to do every single time. And we could give our action spring just a little bit of a wipe down. We've already wiped off the buffer. Next thing we're going to do is snap the buffer back on the spring, and it should retain itself. Depending on quality or parts that were used in building your AR, You may not have a buffer that snaps on the spring. It is preferable that it is this way, but it's not the end of the world if your buffer doesn't snap on one end or the other. And then we'll go ahead and we can lightly oil this if we want to, but honestly, there's not much we need to do. I definitely would never use grease on this. Oil if you're going to do anything. And this can go right back in. Just like that. And now we're good to go with the buffer tube, the buffer, and the action spring. All right, the next thing we can do is just take a rag, wipe off the hammer face, and then around our bolt catch here, we're going to see that there's going to be carbon that's going to build up. So we can take a little bit of oil on a brush or solvent if it's really built up, and we can just kind of clean underneath and around it just like that, and just make sure we're getting that carbon out of there. And checking the function of our bolt catch, make sure it still is under spring tension, it's still working. Next thing we want to do is clean out the magazine well. You can see there's a little bit of carbon in there. You'll generally get some carbon, especially if you're running suppressed, but if you were out shooting, doing a carbine course, you might have sand or dirt or anything in there. So the way I do it is I'll just take my cleaning brush and just cover up one end with the rag and just kind of clean it out inside and out, just to make sure we're getting all that clean. We don't have, you may attack it, you may have to get after it with just the brush by itself if you got some serious sand or anything in there. Once I'm done, last thing I'll do is I'll take an empty magazine and just verify that it's locking in place and that it drops free. Next, we're going to clean out our trigger pocket and this whole inside of the lower. There is some gunkiness that will show up here, especially if you're running suppressed. So the first step that we're going to do is go ahead and drop the hammer. Now we're going to do this safely in that we'll put it on semi or fire. And when I pull the trigger, I want to coast this hammer in its forward position. I don't want to just pull the trigger and let this hammer slam right into our bolt catch, right into the front of the trigger pocket. When we're doing this, you just want to guard it with your thumb and just coast that hammer forward. With the hammer safely put in the forward position, you can go ahead and take some Q-tips and just kind of clean out what you can access, going deep inside there. You'll see we do have some carbon coming out of it. You will see this really bad if you run suppressed. This is going to be blasted with carbon. But really, there's not a routine need to take out these parts, your hammer, your trigger, and all that. I would just leave them in place the vast majority of the time, unless something really bad happened, you got some serious sand or gunk. We can cock the hammer and just kind of, with Q-tips, just move around, just clean what we can access. And then we're going to go ahead and lubricate the critical points. Now, looking at the parts outside of the gun, or a different set of, now this happens to be a mil-spec trigger, but we do have engagement right there, and pulling the trigger will release that. So you can see we've got a polished face right here. I just like to take some CLP or some oil and try to dip some in there, try to dip some just on that surface of the hammer, and I also like to lubricate just right here on that part of the hammer. So just what we can access, we're going to put it on the engagement surface of the hammer. Going to put some more oil, just drop it in. Doesn't need a whole ton of oil here, just enough for those working engagement surfaces. And you can work the hammer a couple times just to make sure that oil is really getting in there. Last thing I would do is we can also oil our selector on both sides of it and work that in as well. All right, we cleaned off any excessive oil that was hanging out, and now we're going to do a basic function check just to know that these parts, the trigger, hammer, disconnector, all that is working properly. So without the upper receiver on the lower, again, we want to guard the hammer when we do this, but we'll have it on fire. And again, guarding the hammer, we should be able to pull the trigger and it'll release the hammer. Now with the trigger still being held down, we're not going to release pressure on this. We're going to check the reset and make sure it's good. So with the trigger still held down, we're going to manually cock the hammer and let it go. All right, and you can guard it just in case, but I'm going to slowly let off the trigger and we should feel and hear the click. Okay, That's our reset functioning properly. And we'll do it again. Okay, now we'll check our safety. So we'll put it on safe and make sure, no matter how hard we pull, that nothing is happening. When we pull on the trigger, we do want it to resist us and spring back. And we could see at least that our fire control group is functional and it is doing its job. One thing we do want to be on the lookout for as we're doing all of this is to make sure that we don't have any serious pebbles, sand, rocks, or especially primers anywhere inside here. Not only is that going to foul this up and probably stop it from working right, but if we have any primers that are hidden, you could shake it, see if there's any rattle, any primers or anything coming out. We should never be in a circumstance where we're blowing primers out of our cartridge cases while we're firing. If that's happening, I would stop shooting the gun, take it to a gunsmith where they could look and see if it's the gun that's having a problem, if it's your ammunition that you're using. But that's part of the reason why we're checking and looking, just to make sure there's no primers or nothing that's stopping your fire control group from working. One of the last things we can do with our lower receiver is just clean out any residual sand or dust that might be hiding in some of these crevices here. Usually behind the trigger right here, you might have some dust or sand. You can just kind of brush that out. And overall, just making sure we don't have anything externally on the gun. It's not going to affect it as much, and it just depends how clean you want it to be on the outside. And just making sure that's good to go. One of the last things we can do is just take some oil on a Q-tip or on a brush. And I like to oil the inside track of these two pins. That's where the detent and the spring are working. And just kind of work that oil in. Last thing I can do is kind of oil my bolt catch and just make sure the oil soaks in and work it a little bit, dry off any excessive oil, and our lower receiver is good to go. Next, we have our upper receiver group. This is where things get a little bit more intensive. So first we'll start by removing the bolt carrier group and charging handle, and we'll do that by grabbing on at least to the left side, whatever charging handle we have, and unlatching it and bringing it about halfway. It doesn't have to be perfect. And you'll notice the relationship between the bolt carrier group and the charging handle, that the bolt has to come to the rear when I pull the charging handle, but when I push the charging handle forward, the bolt does not come with it. So basically we're going to go about halfway on the charging handle. It'll pull the bolt carrier group about that far out. And then we will simply pull the bolt carrier group out. And you can just pull the charging handle, let it fall, and it'll fall out of its track. The charging handle has these two wings right here. So the way that it works in terms of inserting it or taking it out is we got to insert it about this far with applying upward pressure, and then it'll find its groove, snap those wings in, and then the charging handle can be installed. To take it out, just like you saw, we'll remove that bolt carrier after going about halfway, and then we'll just let it fall, and it should fall out of its track, and then we could pull the charging handle out. So just like that, that's how the charging handle works, or how it seats into the upper receiver. The first thing we're going to look at, doesn't really matter what order we go in. I just like to start with the bolt carrier group. First, we're going to check and make sure that these screws, you can see the stakes, 4 stakes in total. We want to make sure that these screws are not loose, that they have not moved. We want to make sure this gas key, this part on top of the carrier, we want to make sure it's not loose. We want to make sure these screws are not loose, and everything is still good to go with that. Another thing we want to check for is to make sure our gas key is not leaking. Now, I drew it with pencil, and you guys can kind of see it. If your gas key is leaking, and these screws may not be loose, they might be perfectly tight, the staking might still be good to go, but you're going to notice either short stroking or just the recoil impulse feels a little delayed. It's kind of hard to describe, but when you take this out and you're suspecting that, or at least when we're cleaning it, without touching too much of the gas key or bolt carrier group, we just want to pull it out and check and see if we see any carbon that looks like this pencil here, where you can see that it's kind of blowing out of the seams. You might see it on either side. You might see it underneath the key. right about here, just kind of blowing out this way. If we see that, chances are we'll probably realize it on the range because we're short stroking, our gun's not running proper. But taking it out, if you see something like that, huge carbon blast, a lot easier to pick up on nickel boron or hard chromed carriers. But you'll still see it on a phosphate carrier just like this. So that lets us know we probably need to replace, or most definitely need to replace our gas key and get that sealed up. Next thing we're going to do is take it apart. So you can take a punch, the tip of a knife, even your fingernail, and we're just going to pull that out from right to left. Next thing we can do is just get the firing pin out, and we can do that usually by tapping just like that, and it'll fall out. This one pretty dirty, so it stuck a little bit. Now that we've got things that far, we've got this guy, our bolt cam. We want to compress the bolt all the way and then rotate this part so now 90 degrees, so now it can clear. Something else you can do is tap it out. It should fall out, or you can grab it out and bring it towards the sky. But either way, we got to get this part out. And lastly, we're just going to pull the bolt out of the carrier itself. Now, like I was saying, this is technically an internal piston gun that your gas tube, the gases will flow into this expansion chamber. It'll then twist and open up the bolt, and the whole carrier will go back to cycle. So you can see this is the bolt tail, the back part of our bolt itself. This is actually, think of it like the head of a piston, and this is your engine block right here. So that's what's going on every time you shoot. So we have the major components of the bolt carrier group. We got the bolt carrier itself. We should never take this apart. There's no need to. It's supposed to stay there permanently unless it breaks or needs replacement. We have our firing pin. We have our bolt cam. We have our firing pin retaining pin, usually called the cotter pin. And then we have our bolt itself. Now we could take this apart one step further. Not always 100% necessary for most shooting, but especially if you've got it pretty dirty, you're going to want to take a punch and push out your extractor pin. If you don't have a punch and you're doing this in the field, you could use, I would not use the firing pin, but you could use the cotter pin and just squeeze those legs together and just push it out just like that. And what that's going to do is we have our extractor pin now, and then our extractor comes off. And you can see with a lot of use, you're going to have some brass shavings, you're going to have stuff and grit that's going to get in there. So you may not need to do this every time, but especially after it's had quite a lot of rounds through it or it's pretty dirty, I would take it apart. You can also see we got some brass shavings in the extractor claw itself. We're going to want to clean that out. And one thing you can do if you are in the field doing this is inside your charging handle, you could see that this channel is hollow. We can actually place all of these parts into the charging handle itself. And that's just a way to keep everything organized and together if you're doing this at the range or in the field where you don't want to lose any of these parts. So first thing I like to do is just kind of give it a wipe down. We don't have any oil or solvent, anything yet. Just kind of wiping these parts down, just getting rid of the surface layer of oil, carbon, any buildup, and just try to get most of that out of our way just from the beginning. And that goes for our bolt cam as well. The top of it, the sides of it, just want to get that cleaned up a little bit. Same thing with our extractor. We don't want to lose that spring and insert. And if it's done right and it's a quality extractor and spring, you shouldn't have a problem. That should just stay the way it is right there. Now we can take our brush and start cleaning out that extractor claw and get rid of all that brass shavings. We can do the same when it comes to our bolt face. And overall, we're just kind of trying to clean out any surface carbon or brass shavings. We haven't really seriously attacked any of it yet, but we're just getting rid of most of it. Next, we'll go to the carrier itself, and just like the other parts, you're going to see some serious carbon gunkage hanging out. We want to try to just do that the best we can just to get rid of as much of that. And one thing you can do is I take, again, the rag on the end of the cleaning brush, and inside the carrier itself, just cleaning off some of that surface stuff. Again, we're not seriously attacking anything yet. We're just getting rid of a lot of it so it gets out of our way. You can do the same in here on the inside of the walls of the carrier and in the back as well. And we have basically done just a quick and dirty cleaning. Now, if you're in the middle of a carbine course and you just got a 10-minute break and you're doing some quick maintenance on this, this right here would be enough. We would just lubricate it, and at least the bolt carrier group would be good to go. But because we're not in a rush and we don't immediately need it, and we want to do a good job, we're going to go a little bit further than just that. Next, we can address our charging handle, and simply wiping it down, again, that's really all it needs on the outside. Now on the inside, you'll notice that hole, and your gas tube sits inside your charging handle just like that when the gun's together and it's working. So you will see just a Q-tip helps here. You're going to see a lot of gunk coming out of the inside of this charging handle. And honestly, just a Q-tip, just like that, cleaning out the inside of it. We're going to want to inspect this latch, make sure that there's no sand or grit nastiness in here. We could take a Q-tip and just kind of clean around the upper part of the charging handle, depending what charging handle you have. And we're just going to want to clean it. And honestly, that is good to go on your charging handle. Surface carbon builds up, but not to the point where you need to scrape it away or anything crazy. That's really all the charging handle is going to need, besides lubrication, before it eventually goes back in. So next, going back to our carrier, just resist the urge to just bury a Q-tip in there. I have seen Q-tips break off, and then if you can't get it out, you're going to have to replace your gas key itself. That part is going to be totally fine. If you have pipe cleaners, that's one thing you can do. Just put a pipe cleaner through there. But I'm cleaning out the bolt cam track right here underneath the gas key. I'll go inside and just kind of the crevices on the inside of the carrier and the gas ring run itself. I'm just trying to get out what I can. I can go over here, and in the back, you're going to see a lot of carbon building up. And just a Q-tip, getting rid of that. Some of you guys will use oil or solvent to try to break down some of this carbon. Honestly, just what you can access and what you can clean for most circumstances, that's going to be just enough to get it done. We'll clean out the back of this track here, and then we'll also take a Q-tip to these ridges where the magazine lips ride in, and just get any carbon, anything like that out. This would generally be considered good for most cleaning. It's going to be perfectly fine. Like I said in the beginning, yes, there is still some carbon in here, but no, not enough carbon that's going to be concerning or cause reliability issues on the gun. Now, some people like to use a scraper like this. This one, the left side is for the inside of the carrier, and this side is for the bolt tail. There's some other features for different parts. I generally don't recommend using scrapers. Again, trying to achieve that white glove standard and get every speck of carbon out of here, I think a lot of times does more damage than good. You got dudes, with their chrome lining on the inside, and they start digging into that. Some stuff is flaking off. They're removing stuff they shouldn't. If we're going to use a scraper, I would just gently use it just like that. Nothing crazy. I'm not applying a serious amount of force. And you will see a little bit of carbon that has come off, but in the end, I'm not a tremendous fan of using scrapers. And if you're going to use them, I would just gently use them. You can shake out any carbon, use a Q-tip, get rid of that. But generally speaking, our bolt carrier is good to go. Next, we're going to go after our bolt. So we've already done the preliminary wipe down. Just going to take a Q-tip, just clean what I can see, just like that. And clean up the bolt face. We don't want to see any primer residue or any serious carbon. While we're here, we do want to inspect and check the function of our ejector and make sure our ejector is actually working. And as long as we got that, we'll be good. We can take a Q-tip and clean the inside of where the bolt cam sits. Now, something to watch for is this is kind of a weakness on this design, especially if this bolt is not made properly or heat treated right. But this bolt can crack right here at these very thin points. So we just want to observe and check and just make sure that we don't see any cracks or anything forming, any spooky stuff going on. That looks perfectly fine. What we can do then is take a pipe cleaner and just kind of clean out the firing pin channel on the inside of the bolt. You can use compressed air to blow out any lint or anything from that's still in there, but we want to make sure we see daylight through there, and just do a preliminary check with our firing pin and just make sure our firing pin wants to slide and move. We still need to clean off the carbon you see around the rim of the firing pin right there. We got to get rid of all of that. That's carbon that needs to go away. We can't leave any of it. The reason why is because that deals with your firing pin protrusion. So if we have too much carbon built up there, the firing pin could get sticky, or the firing pin may not protrude enough to set off our primers and keep the gun running. So when we get to the firing pin, we're definitely going to address that. In terms of the bolt, we're also looking, make sure all of our bolt lugs are here. That's another thing that can happen, is your bolt lugs might shear off, especially if it's not built to a quality type of steel or heat treatment. Usually it's this lug right here that will shear off. And at that point, we obviously want to replace it if we ever see that or that happens. Next, we do have some carbon built up. This is where it will build up pretty significantly on the bolt tail. Now, honestly, that's still not going to be a tremendous issue. Again, if we're going to use a scraper just like this, we want to be kind of gentle with it. We don't want to go too crazy. You can see all that carbon starting to come off. Scrapers have their uses, right? So done a couple passes going the other way, take it off, wipe it off with a rag. You can see we still have some carbon on there, and honestly, that is not going to give us any problems in terms of reliability. Some guys will take a knife and start to scrape on this. I really wouldn't. I would just leave it the way it is. That is not going to affect function. Next, with these gas rings, we just want to make sure that they're here. We don't have any gas rings that sheared off or anything's damaged. You are going to see that these gaps in our gas rings are pretty much aligned for the most part. Now, there's kind of a myth out there, when we put this back together, we need to make sure these gas rings are separated so the gap is not the same. Well, I'm here to tell you that when it goes in the bolt carrier, the gas rings compress and seal themselves off. Nobody cares or should care about, staggering the gas rings. It's okay if they're pretty much all in agreement like this, because when it goes in your carrier, guess what? This crunches and compresses. We do care about the overall diameter of these rings. With enough time, they're going to start to wear down. But in the meantime, we don't need to worry about staggering these gas rings. They're going to be just fine. In fact, the gun in armor school, they had us take out one ring and shoot our M4s with 2 rings. And then they're like, okay, take out a second ring. And our M4s were working just with 1 gas ring. So trying to stagger these, it's not going to matter anyway. They compress together. So that's kind of a side note on the gas rings. We just want to make sure they're here. Don't care if they kind of line up. Doesn't matter. And overall, we don't see any cracks. We don't see any weird wear marks on these bolt lugs. Any cracks or just strange. Don't see any of that. Everything looks good. And this bolt would be ready to put back together. So we're going to go ahead and start putting this back together. One thing we can check is our extractor pin, and we just want to make sure that the extractor just freely likes to fly around. That's going to be good. We don't want to have this binding on anything. So what we'll do is, making sure everything's good, we'll just put it back together. I'm going to have to apply a little bit of pressure to line this up. I just want to make sure that extractor pin is equal on both sides and everything's good to go. Now, something else we can do for our ejector is going to put a little oil just like that and work that oil in just like that, and then take a Q-tip and just wipe off any excessive oil, just so we're working that spring and making sure our ejector is good to go. All right, next thing we're going to do is lubricate the bolt and then insert it into the carrier. Now these are the only two places that the bolt actually touches the inside of the carrier, at the gas rings and then this raised rib right here. So I like to just drop some oil. It's kind of hard to control it from this, but we've got both of those two areas are pretty covered in oil at this point. That's going to be fine. And we will go ahead and insert it in. You should meet resistance. That's your gas rings. You can just kind of twist it and get it in there and work it in just a little bit. And if your bolt is machined right, when it's time to put in our bolt cam, it should only go in one way. I've seen some quality control issues where they drilled it all the way down, and this will actually insert from either direction. But the correct orientation is going to be the extractor on the right side once we insert that. So we can stage it just like that. Again, a quality, properly made bolt, it's not going to let you put that bolt cam in the wrong direction. But we're going to stage it right there. We're going to go ahead and inspect our bolt cam. This is okay to see a little bit of wear, just like that. But if this whole thing is just silver and it's got a huge gouge that's picking up on your fingernail, it's time to replace your bolt cam. Luckily, these are pretty inexpensive and easy to stock up on. But you just want to check, make sure this whole thing doesn't look silver like that. It's okay to have a little wear. This is normal, but we shouldn't have a huge rim that's catching on our fingernail. So after we're happy with that, we can lubricate that, insert it in, and then give it a twist so it's ready to accept the firing pin. And before we insert the firing pin, we do want to get rid of that carbon. Depending on the quality of the chrome lining or the type of firing pin and the coating it has, you might be able to do this with just a brush. But as you can see, there still is some carbon around there, and that's where you can gently take a scraper or something like it and just carefully start to just get rid of that carbon until it's totally clear. All right, so just a couple of minutes off camera, we got rid of all that carbon there, and this firing pin is ready to put back into the bolt carrier group. Now, you can finger apply some oil. I tend to just leave it dry, especially if it's going to be something you're going to store for a long time and it's just going to sit in the gun safe. You really don't want much oil on here just to kind of get gummy and have a stuck firing pin that could cause a slam fire or issues. If it's an AR that you shoot routinely and use often, sure, go ahead, finger apply just a little bit of oil. I just prefer to leave it completely dry, and we can just drop it in. We do want to see that it goes all the way down, and one way that we can ensure we do this right is I'm going to compress the firing pin forward and leave it forward, and then I'm going to compress the bolt and see that my firing pin is protruding and that I have it in the right location. Last thing we're going to do is insert our firing pin retaining pin. Now you'll notice with these two legs, we don't want them to spread apart. This is not really a game of muscling it in there. This is more about geometry. You can spread those legs apart and damage it if you're too crazy with it, and you can see it coming out through the other side. So if you're having problems trying to insert your firing pin retaining pin, you can look through the other side and see your alignment and just get it done. But it should not be a huge muscle game. It's more about geometry. So we can double check. I'm still compressing on that firing pin, and we can see compressing the bolt and firing pin together. We should see the tip of the firing pin. One thing we can do is try to let that firing pin go, but it is being properly retained. So we know that we've put it back together, and we're going to set this aside for now and deal with the actual upper receiver itself. All right, so now we finally get to our upper receiver group. One thing I would do just from the onset is make sure that everything is tight, that any weapon lights or optics or any accessories that you have, just make sure that they're still functional, they're still working, they're still rock solid, nothing is loose, nothing is moved. Just making sure any backup iron sights, we don't have excessive dust or dirt, anything in the aperture. Just make sure all of our stuff is nice and secure on the gun. And that includes foregrips, things like that. Anything we have bolted on the gun that we're expecting to work for us or hold zero, weapon lights, whatever it is, just make sure nothing's loose, make sure everything is functional, anything electronic, and that we've at least got that good to go. Next thing is we're going to deal with the nastiness that we see inside this upper receiver. So the first thing I like to do is, you guessed it, take an oily rag on a brush, and what we're trying to do here is we're just trying to clean out most of the gunk on the inside of the upper receiver. And we can do that. We can use the small brush. We can attack it from different directions, start cleaning out that charging handle recess there, and trying to wipe some of that carbon off the gas tube in there. Just trying to do what we can just with the brush and an oily rag, just trying to clean it out. So just a couple of minutes off camera using that rag on the brush. We've got it pretty decent from where it was. We can take a Q-tip, we can clean this out on either side of our gas tube, just like that. And honestly, we are pretty much there when it comes to the upper receiver itself. We do see that the star chamber, or the barrel extension in there, is pretty gunky. So the next thing that I like to do is use an AR15 chamber brush. However, it depends what's going on. So this, with a 10.5 inch build, this is mainly a home defense, closer range option. This is not a precision instrument. This is not a national match or high power rifle. So, you know, pinpoint sub MOA accuracy is not, you know, we're looking at minute of man size targets, as we would say. So for this, I'm going to use a chamber brush, and then I'm going to be using a bore snake a couple times. It does have, it's a cold hammer forged chrome lined barrel. Now, what I would recommend, or what I would say, is if you're cleaning, maybe you just zeroed it today, your national match AR build, and you're about to compete with it tomorrow, I would forego the chamber brush and I would not mess with the barrel at all. Same goes for if it's like a SWAT team counter sniper rifle, something like that, and you have a good zero on it. I would do all the maintenance that you've seen up until this point, but I would forego the chamber brush. I would forego doing anything to the barrel whatsoever. Now, chances are, if you have something like this, closer range, general recreation, you know, home defense kind of build, it's going to be perfectly fine. But anything that involves precision, point of aim, point of impact, sub MOA, we're doing a competition, or it's really going to count, I would never clean the bore or mess with it, do anything to it at all before I need it for use. But something like this, closer range, don't really have any concerns about it, so we're going to proceed on. All right, so next we have our AR15 chamber brush. It's a really helpful tool. And just on a standard GI cleaning rod, it doesn't have to be just like this. It's meant to be held like that, or you can snap it in there and use another cleaning rod segment to turn it when it's in the chamber, when you're using the cleaning brush or the chamber brush function. So that's what I'm going to go ahead and do now. Just for this, I'm going to soak my chamber brush just with CLP, just oil, and we're going to get started. All right, so insert that. We only want to go generally about that far, and we're just going to kind of twirl it around a little bit, go a little bit backwards and forwards, and just kind of scrubbing what's there, and that's going to be about it. All right, so it is a little oily and a little filthy in here, so we're just going to use the trusted Q-tips. In a pinch, you could use, you know, your brush with a rag. It'll get some of it, and we're just going to be, you can only really attack it from the bottom and from the ejection port, but we're just going to spend a little bit of time cleaning this out. We're going to make sure there's no, you know, steel or, you know, pieces of brush or anything that was left from that chamber brush. If you do have an air compressor or compressed air, this is going to help you out a lot, but it's really just a matter of kind of messing with what you can on these Q-tips. Now, when it comes to that star chamber, some people I know are going to be asking about using a dental pick, maybe cutting down this patch a little bit, putting a patch with a dental pick in there. That can work if you're going to be gentle with it. We don't want to go in there scratching anything. Definitely 2 thumbs up if you've got like the plastic dental picks where you're just moving the patch around in there, but you don't stand the risk of scratching anything or gouging anything. Then I'd say go for it. But if you're going to do a dental pick with patches in that star chamber, I would just be really gentle. You're only in there to get the carbon out, and just be very careful not to scratch anything. All right, so next we have the bore snake. It has this weighted portion right here that goes through from the chamber or breech end all the way to the muzzle. That's how we insert it. It'll go in just that way. And once we got it hanging out through the muzzle, we can pull it through. It does have this double brush portion right here, which I'm going to go ahead just put a little bit of oil on. And then the whole thing is a giant cleaning patch, essentially. Now, it does have this loop. I would strenuously urge everyone, do not put any cleaning patches or put anything on the back of this. I have seen guns get jammed up where there was too much cleaning patch that was put on here. They were trying to pull it through, like tied it to a tree and was trying to pull it through, and it just got stuck too far in to where you couldn't use a multi-tool to take it out, and the barrel was basically done for. So I would not use this with patches at all. But what I'm going to do is just going to send this through and pull it through just twice. Generally going to be pretty good. You can see it's hanging out the bottom. And just making sure we're not getting caught up on anything. And we're just going to do that one more time. And can't really show it on camera, but that bore is looking nice and shiny, nice and clean. At least clean enough for duty, service, defensive firearm just like this. Again, national match, sniper section guys, dudes doing that. Your protocol is going to look a lot different. Now, for those of you guys who have a front sight base like this, or even if you have your backup iron sights and they all pretty much work similar to this, just take a little brush, just get rid of if there's any dust in there. You can put a little drop of oil, and that's more than I wanted, but it's kind of hard to control it on that thing. Now, we're not going to adjust the front sight. We're just going to push down and work that detent just a little bit. And then we want to make sure this is completely dry. There's nothing shiny here. That's more personal preference, but just making sure that front sight detent gets moved around. So we are pretty much done with the upper. If there's any carbon or dust, it would mainly be aluminum, a little bit of aluminum residue or sand or dust. Just going to clean that out for the charging handle. But pretty much this is good to go. You're going to see some carbon definitely shows up on the gas tube right here. Honestly, if it bothers you, you can take a Q-tip and just like try to clean that out. Honestly, it's going to happen. Just let it happen. You'll see we do have dust kind of on the delta ring. Doesn't bother me. It's not affecting anything. So, I mean, if you need to move it or use a brush or compressed air, fine. But it's not, I care about the inside, not the outside, as you can see here. All right, it's kind of hard to get it to show up on camera, but we do want to keep after right here on this surface of the inside of our upper receiver. That's where the bolt cam is contacting every single time. So with enough use and enough shooting, this is going to start to wear away to the point that you may need to replace your upper. Generally only going to see that on shorter builds like this. 16, 18, 20 inch is going to last for a long time. We do want to watch out for any weird wear patterns. You can see these silver areas right there, and that's the only side I really see it on. And that's probably from, you can kind of see the two silver parts of our bolt carrier right there. maybe we're a little proud. This is a new bolt carrier group, so performed flawlessly, but it is still kind of breaking in. But we do want to pay attention to that, see if there's any cracks, any weird wear marks or patterns. This mark here has been here for a long time. That was from a really bad bolt carrier group that I was testing at the time. So just being familiar with your upper receiver, looking at the wear patterns and seeing how it's developing as time goes on is something we should be doing. All right, this is about the best I can try to show it, but you can see our forward assist pawl right there. And I do like to drop just a couple drops of oil in there, work it in, wipe off the excess. I'm gonna do that off camera. It's gonna be a little hard to do with this weird angle. One thing we can do is put a little bit of oil right there on our ejection port cover, just to kind of help it. Usually this rod, this spring, this whole assembly doesn't really need much. As long as we got a little bit of oil and we're kind of working in that detent, I'm gonna clean off the excess and we're gonna be good to go with that. So I do like to inspect my muzzle device. You suppressor guys, you know there's just gonna be carbon, just ungodly amounts of carbon building up. There's nothing too much you can do about it. If you feel so inclined, you could take a Q-tip with some oil, try to clean that out. Honestly, I don't care. It's not affecting anything as long as I don't have rocks or pebbles or anything in there, which we would have discovered trying to clean out the bore. I just leave it alone, to be honest. So now it's time to start putting everything together. So starting with the charging handle, I take a little bit of oil on a brush and I'm just putting a little bit, doesn't need much, just on those wings. I put a little dab just right there. Now the right side of the charging handle always gets more wear than the left side, and that's just because we're grabbing, or at least minimum we have to grab onto at least the left side to open it. So we could put a little bit there, finger apply it. Charging handle does not need much. Ideally, if everything's going the plan, you only need this once to initially load the gun. But we do want to have some lubrication on here in case we got to clear malfunctions and we do have to work the charging handle. So just like before, we're going to insert it into the large opening. Once we make it into the large opening, we're applying upward pressure until those wings snap in place. Sometimes you can overrun it and do it that way, so purposely over insert it, pushing up until it clicks in. And we're going to go about halfway on that. Next, with the bolt carrier group, everything is ready to go. You're going to notice these 4 rails. There's one there. So this rail, we got this guy right here, same thing on that side, and same thing with this long rail. Those are going to be the only places that the bolt carrier actually interacts with the inside of your upper receiver. So I like to oil those 4, and you notice the whole body of the carrier, there's no oil there. It's just on the 4, we call that the raceway. It's just on your 4 raceway rails. Some guys have talked about oiling up the bolt lugs in the past. Honestly, especially if you're headed into dusty or austere conditions, I would just leave that dry, just the way it is. We don't want to have a whole bunch of oil inside our star chamber. Can't really see it from this angle, but I was sure to, after the bore brush or the chamber brush, that I dried it out with Q-tips, made sure there's no oil left. So with that said, final check. I'm pushing up on the firing pin, pushing down on the bolt. I can see it's protruded. I can see it's good to go. And I will go ahead and insert that all the way in. So the question becomes, when is it time to replace those gas rings that we were just talking about? We can see them through the vent holes right there. So we should have resistance. The bolt, if I tilt it up, the bolt should not automatically scrunch in. And if I upend it, the bolt should not fall. If that's happening, it's well since time to replace those gas rings. So the way we can test it is by fully extending the bolt just like that, place it on a flat surface and see if the bolt carrier group holds up its own weight. If it can't hold up its own weight and it scrunches in, that lets us know that it's time to replace them. This, since it's a brand new bolt carrier group and it's only had about 450 rounds, I can feel the resistance. It's still pretty tough, so these gas rings are in it for a while. All right, so now we can reattach our upper and lower receiver. And again, this might be a little tight. You may need a nylon or a rubber hammer, some gentle taps to get those pins back in. But now we do have the pistol, or the AR, is back together. And I like to cycle that a couple times, spread that oil inside our upper, make sure everything looks good. We already function checked our fire control group, so we know it's working before we even got here. Honestly, at this point, last thing I would do is just attach the sling, and we are back in action. One final thing you can do is, with any of your optics, just make sure that you don't have oil splashed on the front or back lenses, and make sure that you can still see a clear sight picture. You can see your red dot, your holographic, your stadia of your scope, whatever you have. Just make sure you didn't have any oil on it. Something I forgot to do this time around, but if you do have scope caps, while you're cleaning, you can just decide to close these and just eliminate that possibility right away. Well, thanks for tuning in and sticking with the video. Again, this is not a white glove cleaning, everything that you just saw, but that's definitely enough to keep your AR-15 running and perfectly functional. So thanks for watching. Comment for any questions.